part 3 of our study on the Dead Sea Scrolls. We are going to look at the group who collected the scrolls that came to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, most likely wrote some of those scrolls themselves. They are a group called the Essenes. Now, in part 1, we talked about the history, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then about some issues with some modern day forgeries, some controversy with the Dead Sea Scrolls. In part 2, we looked at the manuscripts. What will you actually find if you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls? What type of writings are found there? And then here in part 3 now, we're going to talk about the Essenes, the group who wrote some of the scrolls, who collected them. And this group is somewhat of a mystery today, thanks to some conflicting reports when you compare the 3 men who were contemporaries of the Essenes and wrote about them, that they are Josephus, Pliny the Elder, and Philo the Alexander. And if you compare their comments about the group with the writings that you discover in the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, where the Essenes wrote about themselves, and then if you compare their writings to the people who wrote about them, and then the archaeological discoveries from the dig site of Qumran, where they lived for a period of time, not everything lines up. We don't even know specifically the time in the intertestamental time period where the Essenes began, where this group of people broke off from standard Judaism in order to form their own sect. So what I'm going to say in this lesson is going to be somewhat accurate. If I say something and you hear somebody else say something somewhere else, it's probably because they heard another report from archaeological evidence, from other historians from that time period, that conflict with what I found in other material, and we're not 100% sure who is right. Probably the only specific thing we know for definite about the Essenes is when they ceased to exist, which is the year AD 68. And we'll get to 68 AD a little bit later in the study. But we have this group who, some of them, most of them lived in the desert or in the wilderness. They had very few material possessions, and because of that, it is hard to know everything about them with absolute certainty. But at some point before the year 100 BC, that is over 100 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, probably closer to the year 200 BC, a group of Jews broke off from what I would call the mainstream religious life of Judaism. That religious life that was connected to the temple, that would one day be focused upon the worship at Herod's temple. The normal image of the Essenes is that they're living in a communal town off the coast of the Dead Sea in Qumran, one of the lowest places on the earth. In reality, the majority of Essenes did not ever live in Qumran, but they lived in small villages, wilderness, deserted places throughout the land of Judea. For the most part, what Essenes were trying to do is avoid cities, highly populated areas, and the priestly class. But most of them were scattered throughout the land of Judea. This is one reason that some scholars have called John the Baptist an Essene, because John the Baptist lived in the wilderness. He called out the priesthood of his day. And although he may have never lived in Qumran, there was a requirement that was never a requirement to be part of that group who wrote the Dead Seas. I don't think this is that is all that common today, but there was a push at one point to see John the Baptist as an Essene prophet and to see Jesus as an Essene Messiah. The problem is that when you get down to the details of what John and Jesus taught, there's too much to separate them from this group who compiled the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes were Jews who wanted to live a lifestyle that was as observant to the law as possible, to the meticulous, and I would say the obsessive. And one of the hallmarks of Jesus' ministry was calling the Pharisees away from that type of legalistic obedience to the law. But one place where Jesus and the Essenes would have seen eye to eye would have been their view of the priesthood of that time period. They saw the priesthood as aligning themselves in an ungodly manner with the Greeks, the Romans, the secularism of their day. In fact, there could be one small argument that's made in the book of Hebrews where the author is taking an Essene argument. The author of Hebrews writes about how the priests are appointed by God. And this could be taken as a dig at the priesthood because of the corruption that they had to make sure that they're pulling the strings with the Romans to see who would get selected as the priesthood. You had Caiaphas, who was the high priest, and then ended up having 6 of his sons and one of his son-in-law end up being high priest underneath after him, where he could still basically control everything with his sons serving as short periods of time as a priesthood. And the Essenes looked at all of that and they saw that corruption and they're like, we're getting out of here. And some of them decided to live in a central location in a land called in an area called Qumran, and it is these individuals who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. So close to 100 BC, a group of them left the normal population areas of Judea altogether and made their own community in the desert lands. That is the area of Qumran. Now, this is not a recent designation, but this is the ancient title for that community. Now, where is Qumran? Qumran is located on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. It's set off the salty seashores of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea itself is one of the great wonders of the world. It is a body of water that is 31 miles long and 9 miles wide, and it is a surprisingly 1,000 feet deep. But if you decide to go and swim in the Dead Sea, you don't need to worry about drowning in those deep waters because you're going to float in the Dead Sea thanks to the high content of salt in the water. The Dead Sea not only is rich for minerals, but water, but also many different minerals can be extracted from the Dead Sea in that area. Josephus, in his time period, actually along with most of that time period, didn't call the Dead Sea, but they called it the Sea of Asphalt because it was one of the few areas in the world where you had naturally occurring asphalt. So if the ancient Romans wanted any asphalt in the work that they were doing, they had to get it from the Dead Sea. The only signs of life in that area are Nubian ibexes, rock rabbits, foxes, starlings are the only bird that you will find, and lots of bats. Now let's go on a little bit of a picture tour of Qumran so we can see what we mean by these are desert lands. Here is the simple marker that you would see if you were to make your way down to the Qumran archaeological dig, the Scroll Caves, or the Dead Sea. And what you will find there is nothing but a lot of rock and barren land. This is probably the best picture that I found that sort of shows you what Qumran looks like. You can both see the dig site, how it's nothing but barren rock and desert all around. One of the things I love about it is looking at the mountains behind the area of the archaeological dig site. You can see the caves are right there. You can even, if you look closely in that picture, you can see little dots and holes in those mountainsides where they could have stored their possessions, their jars, their scrolls, and so forth. So what it reveals to us is that the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls are is very close to Qumran itself. But the interesting thing is that you can turn around from this view of the mountains, just look in the other direction, and all of a sudden you have a water view. As Qumran looked from one direction up to the barren hills and looked to the other direction to a barren body of water. I call it the body of water because you won't have anything living in the Dead Sea. That's why it's called that. Also, if you were dying of thirst and decided to drink water from the Dead Sea, you would die of thirst quicker from having drank that water because it's basically going to poison you. So there's a picture of the encampment. Here's another picture of what the little encampment looked like at Qumran. Qumran was never very large. It could never support a major population. Although if they wanted to, they have ample building supplies all around them to build more and more rooms. So if they could have had more people want to live there, they could have easily expanded, but obviously not a lot of people wanted to live in Qumran. And you can see from the pictures why. So here's another angle of the dig site. The text for that sign on the screen says ritual bath. They practice the cleansing practices of the Mosaic Law and then added on a whole bunch of cleansing practices on top of those that you find in the Mosaic Law. But through these pictures, I just wanted to show you how barren this land is, how extreme of an action it would be to move out to this wilderness. Temperatures at Qumran reach as high as 118 degrees in the summer. The average high temperature in the summer is 97 degrees. The air is also very dry in that area, which results to a lot of skin conditions. Thankfully, we don't struggle from those skin conditions here in New Orleans. But the annual rainfall in Qumran is less than 2 inches a year. If we wanted to compare that with our own area, we have had 6.37 inches of rain in the last 30 days. So we get more rain every single month, twofold, 3 times as much rain in a month as they will get in an entire year. So Qumran is a brutal place to live. One of the interesting archaeological notes, though, about Qumran, looking at how brutal of a place it is to live, is that the Essenes didn't actually build the original foundation encampments, but they built up a site that was already there. Someone, we have no idea who it was, built the original Qumran site in the 8th century. So we're talking sometime during the Assyrian dynasty. But we have no idea who lived there during that time period. All we know is that sometime between the year 200 BC to the year 100 BC, a group of Jews who called themselves Essenes took up residence in that area. Although there was a period of time where they did not live in Qumran at all. There was a massive earthquake in the area in 31 BC, and for anywhere from 5 to 20 years, the area of Qumran was unoccupied by the Essenes as a result of the effects of that earthquake. So there was a time right sort of in the middle of their highest point of numbers where they didn't live in Qumran at all. Now, as to why they traveled there in this time period, our best guess is from the Damascus document. The Damascus document writes that the tribe of Aaron grew fat on the land and on account of their own iniquity. God raised up a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. So why they went up there, the tribe of Aaron, the priestly tribe, grew fat on taking funds and resources from all the rest of the people. And on account of their iniquity, God raised someone up who guided them into the wilderness. Now, it's hard to say if this teacher of righteousness was guiding them according to the teacher's heart or according to God's heart. It's also hard to say whether there was actually an individual who was the teacher of righteousness or this sort of symbolized that generational movement that was moving out there. But beyond that, we don't really have any details as to how the Essenes got started. But we do know for certainty when they ended. In 86 AD, the Romans were hot on the Sicarii in the time period right before the fall of Jerusalem. Now, the Sicarii was a radical faction who opposed the Romans. They were known as dagger men. That's what their title means. And the Romans wanted to do away with these daggermen. And so the 10th Roman Legion, under Lucius Falvius Silva, tracked them down in the wilderness. Now, the rebel forces ran all the way to Masada, which was Herod the Great's fortified desert refuge that he built. And they held out at Masada for some time. There's old stories, tells, legends about them holding out on Masada until they were killed. But while the Romans were tracking down the rebels, they came upon the town of Qumran. And when they came upon Qumran, they leveled it. They wiped it off the face of the earth. They destroyed everyone they killed everyone who was living in it. And so the tragedy or the irony of the Essenes is that they left Judea because they saw the corruption of the priesthood. They were upset at how the way the Jews were aligning themselves to the Romans. They saw the danger of all of that practice. So they said, let's get out of here and let's get away from this potential evil that's going to happen between the Jews and the Romans. And even though they saw the danger of what was coming, they still ended up being unintended casualties of the fall in Jerusalem. And the destruction of Jerusalem, combined with the destruction of Qumran, led to the total ceasing of existence of the Essenes. Now, what is meant to be an Essene, how they live their daily life, we have some details, but sometimes what one person reports about how they lived doesn't always align with someone else. And so we'll read what was the longest description of the Essenes from someone writing during this time period, and that's the description of Pliny the Elder in his work Natural History. So Pliny writes the following of the Essenes. On the west side of the Dead Sea, but out of range of the noxious exhalations of the coast, is the solitary tribe of Essenes, which is remarkable beyond all the other tribes in the whole world, as it has no women and has renounced all sexual desire, has no money, and has only palm trees for company. Day by day, the throng of refugees is recruited to an equal number by numerous ascensions of persons tired of life and driven thither by the waves of fortune to adopt their manner. Thus, through thousands of ages, incredible to relate, a race in which no one is born lives on forever. So prolific for their advantage to us is other men's weariness of life. Lying below the Essenes was formerly the town of Engedi, second only to Jerusalem in fertility of its land and in its groves of palm trees, but now, like Jerusalem, a heap of ashes. Pliny the Elder lived from 23 to 79 AD. So he clearly wrote this account of the Essenes shortly after their destruction, as if the fires of Jerusalem were still smoldering and the ashes had not yet been cleaned up. So he was a contemporary of the group, but it was interesting the number of things he got wrong in that report. He thought they were thousands of years old, but they weren't. He called them a tribe as having no women. But we have found both women and children in the cemetery at Qumran. Joseph writes on how men in Qumran, Essenes, married for the express purpose of keeping up their numbers. And I could see some of them men, I hate to do it, but I would volunteer to marry and have a family just to make sure we keep our numbers up. I'll renounce all desires of it, but I'll do it just for the purpose of the community. Well, we've actually found that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the major debates between the Pharisees and the Essenes, and I can't believe this was one of their major debates, but it kind of illustrates how the world has changed a lot, was over whether it was acceptable according to the law for a man to marry his niece. Documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls write on how it is abhorrent for a man to marry his brother's daughters, but the Pharisees said, I don't see anything wrong with that. And it's not surprising that the Essenes would be even more conservative than the Pharisees were in any issue where they debated. So there were some women and children in their midst. Now, based on the number in the cemetery, it appears the numbers were always very small, much smaller than you would consider normal for an overall population. So some may have called themselves celibate. Some may have practiced celibacy, but to say that all of the Essenes were celibate, all of them gave up women, and there were no women in their midst, that is just untrue because there clearly were some. The one thing that seemed to be universal when outside groups commented on the Essenes is that when you added their numbers up, how many people were in that group, the desert community combined with those who were living in the lands of Judea, there were approximately 4,000 Essenes at any given time throughout their existence. Now, since multiple people wrote about that number, 4,000, I wonder if they were really like in some way counting these people, or if one guy wrote 4,000 and the rest of the people just ran with it, but that was seen to be about the size of their community. Now, we also believe that they were pacifists. They were entirely opposed to armed conflict, although according to Josephus, they would carry arms with them when traveling for self-defense. But on top of that, they were entirely against being armed. No weapons were found in the archaeological remains of Qumran, so there's even some debate on maybe they didn't even carry weapons with them when they traveled. And obviously this would mean that when a legion of Roman soldiers came in and decided to wipe out their town, they would receive no resistance from those who were living there. Pliny also said they had no money, but interestingly enough, the community as a whole held quite a bit of money. We found coins in the jars in the mountains. We've actually found over 500 of them. Josephus writes that if you desire to join the Essenes, the first step of initiation is that you would give up all your funds. You'd put them all into the community pot. And so I wonder if since we found, 500 coins in those caves, if maybe that meant that they took the money and just sort of put it aside in the caves and left it. Or maybe if there was somebody who was greedy, hoarding it all together, we can't truly say. The initiation process to be a member of Qumran, that lasted about 3 years. The newcomer would be welcomed into a community that was very hierarchical in the way that it was lived. That means new members had very little control over their daily lives. They had a set schedule that consisted primarily of 3 different activities. They prayed, they ate meals, and they worked. So to me, it sounds like they were a lot like monks. They're just praying, eating meals, working. A lot of their work is going to be cleaning. Now, what they would eat is difficult to determine for the entirety of their diet because there's only one type of food that you have evidence of that is left over from 1,000 years, and that is animal bones. We believe we found the location where they deposited the bones after they ate their meals, and so they would have ate sheep, goats, and cattle. So if you liked chicken, I would encourage you not to become an Essene because it looks like they didn't eat any of that. Now, the actual site of Qumran isn't large. Earlier, I showed you this wide shot on the screen. And if you can look, the actual location of Qumran is very, very small in that picture. We zoom in and find it's just that little spot. Even the big area that's in the back, obviously, was not part of their original encampment. It's believed that a maximum of 75 people could live at Qumran at a time. So that means if there were 4,000 members of the Essene community, the vast majority of them did not live in the wilderness. The main feature of the settlement was a large 3-story watchtower that served as the administrative heart of the community. But the center of the community really focused on the collection, the storage, and the use of water. Remember, they're located in one of the driest locations on Earth. The only body of water that is near them is entirely unusable, so they constructed a large number of waterways that were designed to funnel rainwater throughout the area into the Qumran settlement. Because apparently when it rains in that area, it rains hard for a short period of time. Most of the rain does not settle into the dirt, so it's actually, it fits well if you can get the right channels to flow that rainwater into the community. Once the rainwater came into the community, it primarily had 2 different purposes. Not drinking. You're most likely going to be drinking wine for your drinking during that time period because that rainwater is probably going to make you sick after going throughout those channels on the dirty ground. But they had numerous pools for washing. And it's crazy. They live in the desert, and one of their main features is we're going to have all these pools for washing, which are basically baptismal tanks. They even had these special entrance down into their tanks where you'd walk down one staircase, get dunked into the water, come back up another staircase to symbolize that you have been ritualistically cleaned. They'd also use the water for washing, lots and lots of washing. They were obsessed with washing their cups, their plates, their bowls. There's a good chance that they were so obsessed about that they had multiple bowls, cups, plates for each person. Because that's one thing we've discovered at the site is where they stored their pottery, and they had more than enough, ample more than enough for 75 people who lived there. So they were washing a ton. They were ritualistic about it. They even sloped their floors slightly so they could thoroughly just dump the rooms full with water to wash them, and then the water could flow out of the room after it was used. So they had this obsession with purity that was not only about getting away from the corrupt priesthood, the corrupt Jews who sided with the Romans, but it was also how they washed their entire body, how they immersed themselves in baptism, how they cleaned their utensils, how they cleaned their floor. And adding to that, we have the discovery of 2 toilets in Qumran. You can see a picture of one of them on the screen. So they had not 1, but 2 toilets for the 75 people who lived there. And you might initially think like, wow, 2 toilets for 75 people. That's not where I want to live. If I need to have more than, if I have more than two people for toilet in my household, I do not know how I am going to make it. Um, but the interesting thing is that the toilet that's on the screen there, that toilet most likely broke during the major earthquake of 31 BC. They weren't able to discern how to fix it and repair the toilet. Toilet technology was very rare and complicated during that time period. So they built a second toilet. So while they had two toilets in their community, they probably only had one at a time, which may sound crazy to us. One toilet for 75 people, but it actually points to their obsession for cleanliness, because we're still in the time period where only the wealthiest of wealthiest and most powerful individuals had indoor toilets. The most common toilet and bathroom at this time period was not even an outhouse, but it was simply the outdoor wilderness that was behind the home in which you lived if you lived in an area outside of a city. And if you lived in a city, your toilet would be a bucket where you would throw the contents of your toilet out the window. One of the interesting things about this fact is that the most common law in the Roman Empire was outlawing emptying your chamber pot out of your second story window. Why? Because if you're walking down a city walk and somebody dumps their chamber pot out a second story window, you're probably going to get splashed on by stuff you don't want to be splashed on. So most of the people in that time period had never even seen a toilet. And so the fact that they had one at Qumran, they reconstructed another one since that got destroyed, really showed their obsession, their unusual concern with cleanliness. So if you lived back then and you had to pick a community to live in, and you're like the Essenes are asking you to go to Qumran, you have to debate, do I want a toilet or do I want chicken? And decide how you're going to live based on that decision. So if you're a germaphobe who really wants indoor plumbing, Qumran just might be the place to be. The other part of their community was their scriptorium. We've actually found 3 inkwells that was in the room that was the scriptorium that still has ink inside of them after all of that time period. The scriptorium consisted of a narrow, low-lying tables, benches that are built into the wall. And so the Essenes not only collected scrolls together, because we have scrolls that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are older than the Essenes, older than the Qumran community, but they most likely wrote several of their own scrolls and documents during that time period. And if one were to read the scribal notes that we have seen in a lot of ancient documents where they were being written by hand, what you would end up discovering is that being a scribe was one of the worst forms of manual labor. That according to those who were doing it, being a scribe was just about as difficult as being a ditch digger. It made your back ache. You were bored to death with the monotony of the work. The pay was awful. On top of that, you needed specialized training in order to be a scribe, but then the work ended up being work that you would hate. And yet the people of Qumran left society. They gave up sexual pleasures. They cleansed themselves consciously. They did awful manual labor. They lived in the desert. Why? Why would they do all of this? Well, the ultimate reason that they did all of this is that they believed that they were literally the last generation on earth. Now, this is much different from our Christian belief that Jesus could come back at any time, because we believe Jesus could come back today. He could come back tomorrow, or he could come back 100 years from now. So we always have to live with our feet straddling 2 different beliefs. I need to live as if my Messiah could come back today, my master could show up today, and I need to make sure that I'm diligent in my work for him. But I also need to live as if he won't come back for 100 years, because I don't know when he will return. Well, the Essenes in Qumran, they believed this was the end of days. They were apocalyptic people. They were a doomsday people. They had writings that their worship and their worship alone was joining with the choirs of angels in heaven. This is one of the reasons they were obsessed with the writings such as the book of Enoch, because they believed that they were joining with the angels in heaven. It was going to be in their generation when the angels would come back and return to the earth. But instead of like other doomsday preppers,
They did not drink the Kool-Aid. They went out and lived in the desert in order to prepare for the end of days. They believed that the earth was ending anyway, so why collect the wealth, the status, the prestige of this world, because it's all going to be gone anyway. Now, those are the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, so I hope you can keep that in context when we're talking about what they wrote, what they stored, the documents that they had. And the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the impact that the Dead Sea Scrolls have on our understanding and the trustworthiness of the Old Testament.